Developing the knight towards the center immediately prepares for flexible pawn structures and potential queenside action. Mirroring white's knight development maintains symmetrical piece deployment, setting a solid foundation for an even strategic contest. Opening up central space immediately establishes territorial claims and prepares for rapid development. Opening the diagonal for the queen's bishop sets up solid central control and prepares for kingside development. Asserting central influence, white immediately stakes a claim, aiming to control key squares and prepare for future pawn expansion or piece development. Initiating a pin, this maneuver immediately disrupts white's developing harmony and seeks to simplify into a more favorable pawn structure. Challenging the bishop's check, this develops the bishop while preparing to recapture and consolidate control of the center. Challenging white's central space aggressively, black immediately opens up lines for piece activity and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure. Prepares fianchetto, reinforcing the queenside's future control while opening diagonals for queen and bishop. Trading that bishop offers a clear path to a more active queen and opens diagonals for future piece play. Reclaiming the queen and centralizing it on a more active square, this recapture solidifies white's control over the d-file while simultaneously preparing for queenside expansion, potentially with b4, and ensuring the king is now much safer tucked behind the pawn chain. e4 boldly confronts the central queen, disrupting white's immediate plans and creating a dynamic pawn structure that demands careful consideration from your opponent regarding piece development and piece exchanges in the d5 square. Retreating the queen to e3, white aims to redeploy for a central assault, eyeing the now exposed e4 knight while simultaneously preparing to castle kingside. This repositioning creates a dynamic tension, forcing black to consider how best to protect their central pawn structure. It's a subtle maneuver that speaks to white's desire for active piece play and potential queenside pressure, rather than immediate confrontation. A timely check, forcing a redirection of white's queen and disrupting its central influence. This tactical jolt aims to seize initiative by creating immediate threats and potentially unraveling white's pawn structure in the center. Developing the knight to a more active square, this knight now eyes the c4 pawn and potentially supports a kingside pawn push, while simultaneously preparing to retreat the queen if necessary. Exchanging queenside knights clears a path for black's queen to become more active on the queenside, potentially creating outpost opportunities for the remaining knights and increasing pressure along the open c-file as the middle game develops. Reclaiming the center with the knight now allows white to develop pieces more harmoniously, aiming to control key central squares and prepare for potential pawn advances. Anchoring the king safely sets a solid foundation, anticipating potential skirmishes in the center, and allowing for a more flexible development of the remaining pieces. Opening a central file abruptly invites black's queen into the fray, a calculated risk to disrupt their development or a premature pawn sacrifice that opens lines for counterplay. A clever repositioning, this knight seeks greener pastures on the queenside, aiming to participate in the queenside pawn play or perhaps even find a surprising outpost on c7. Developing the bishop to g2 aims to complete white's kingside castling and place the bishop on a more active diagonal, eyeing the queenside while simultaneously preparing for potential central pawn pushes. Black's queen, now centralized on c5, aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create immediate counterplay, potentially targeting the d4 pawn and influencing the c-file. The board opens up dramatically, leading to a potentially simpler, yet still tactically charged middle game where piece activity will be paramount, demanding vigilance in defending the now exposed king. The immediate recapture of the pawn immediately centralizes the knight, creating a dynamic outpost for the piece and contesting the light squares that have been somewhat neglected since black's bishop was exchanged. This castling maneuver dramatically alters the game's complexion, instantly anchoring the king to the queenside and unleashing the rook onto the open d-file, a central artery now ripe for exploitation. Black opts to challenge white's queenside expansion, aiming to disrupt the pawn structure and create counterplay on the file. This move initiates a dynamic struggle for control of the remaining open lines and potentially prepares further pawn advances to gain space or attack the white king. Reconquering the central square after a brief skirmish is the aim here, but it sacrifices valuable development time and allows black to consolidate their knight's strong outpost. A strategic repositioning to bolster the d-file, preparing to contest it actively with the rook. This aims to disrupt white's queenside development and potentially create weaknesses in their pawn structure, especially if white commits to further pawn pushes without adequate support. Sensing an opportunity for aggressive pawn advancement, this move stakes a claim on the 6th rank, aiming to restrict black's pieces and create attacking chances. Unleashing the rook on an open file, Ra6 strategically aims to disrupt white's centralized rook and potentially eye the kingside if white isn't careful. This active placement, while seeming aggressive, could also be a precursor to regrouping operations or even a bid for some central counterplay down the line. The question remains, can black exploit this newfound activity before white solidifies their control and launches their own initiative? The rook now anchors itself on the d-file, a crucial central artery, aiming to exert pressure and restrict black's minor pieces. Shielding the king from the looming pressure on the d-file, this maneuver brings the monarch to a more secure square, preparing for potential pawn advances or knight repositioning in the near future, while acknowledging the positional limitations imposed by white's rook on the 6th rank. Repositioning the knight to c3 aims to bolster the center and prepare for potential pawn advances, while simultaneously creating a more robust defensive structure around white's king. The black king embarks on a precarious journey toward the center, a bold maneuver seeking respite from the potential onslaught on the queenside, yet simultaneously exposing itself to the attacking possibilities that white's connected rooks and knight might exploit on the open files. Suddenly, the knight leaps to the 5th rank, creating a powerful outpost and threatening to infiltrate black's position, while simultaneously eyeing the queenside pawns and limiting the scope of the black queen. Black strategically decides to dismantle white's advanced knight outpost, accepting a pawn deficit for a more active piece placement. Initiating the exchange on the d-file immediately addresses the overloaded rook on d6, converting a potential tactical issue into a simplified, more manageable position where white's king's safety is paramount. The knight, after its journey across the board, now finds a more active outpost, aiming to disrupt white's seemingly harmonious piece placement and potentially infiltrate the queenside. Asserting dominance on the queenside, the rook's repositioning creates immediate pressure along the b-file and eyes potential weaknesses within black's pawn structure, aiming to restrict the knight's mobility and provoke a passive response. Black unleashes central pressure, challenging the queen's rook and aiming to unshackle their pieces from the cramped position. This pawn thrust opens lines and creates dynamic counterplay, forcing white to immediately address the threatened pieces and consider the pawn structure's future. Challenging the central pawn structure, this exchange immediately opens critical lines for both sides, demanding careful calculation to avoid tactical pitfalls, especially concerning white's exposed king. Black decisively seizes the center, anchoring the isolated pawn and preparing to activate the rook on d8, potentially targeting white's weakened queenside structure. Probing the weakened queenside pawn structure, the knight's foray to a7 aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially isolate the d5 pawn while creating a sanctuary from further exchanges. The knight's journey to c5 marks a pivotal moment, aiming to solidify control over the queenside and potentially disrupt white's pieces. This relocation is a strategic gamble, exchanging immediate pawn pressure for a more active knight poised to exploit any weaknesses in white's seemingly solid pawn structure. It's a subtle but potent attempt to initiate counterplay and prevent white from comfortably establishing a dominant outpost for their own pieces. Rook on b5 exerts significant pressure, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially infiltrate the queenside. White's maneuvering has successfully isolated the knight, creating a positional advantage. Finally, the black king ventures out of his safe haven, initiating a daring journey towards the center, a bold assertion of his newfound activity in this peculiar endgame scenario. Capturing the pawn on a5 immediately initiates a decisive material advantage for white, fundamentally altering the balance of the game and forcing black into a defensive posture. Unlocking the bishop's potential through this diagonal is a clever gambit for increased activity, directly challenging white's somewhat isolated knight and potentially disrupting its defensive formation. Probing for weaknesses, this pawn thrust aims to destabilize black's control of the d5 square and create potential outpost opportunities for the knight. The knight's journey to a6 may seem peculiar, but it aims to achieve a crucial defensive maneuver, fortifying the weakened pawn structure and preparing to contest the open d-file should the opportunity arise. This repositioning subtly addresses the potential for white's rook to exploit the isolated pawns, while simultaneously creating a safer harbor for the king. It's a quiet, preparatory move that sacrifices immediate attacking potential for long-term structural integrity. Disrupting black's tentative pawn push, this capture forces a crucial decision, potentially unlocking the b-file for white and exposing the black king's slightly compromised central position, all while preparing to consolidate the material advantage gained from the earlier exchanges. The black king, now exposed on e7, desperately seeks refuge, hoping to escape the relentless pressure and avoid being corralled by white's encroaching pieces on the open files. Securing the central file with the rook exchange is paramount, now that the queens are off the board and the kings are starting to venture out. This simplifies white's path to active rook play and isolates black's weakened pawns. Embracing the inevitable material deficit, black's king steps into the fray, seeking to consolidate and perhaps activate itself in this challenging endgame, a stark contrast to its previous passive confinement. White seeks to exploit the cramped nature of black's remaining pieces, aiming to establish a passed pawn on the queenside while securing its own king. Pondering a strategic repositioning, black seeks to solidify their pawn structure and prepare for potential future piece activity. The knight's jump now creates a forced exchange, aiming to simplify into a favorable rook and pawn ending where black's king is awkwardly placed, potentially allowing the white king to become more active and support a passed pawn push later. The monarch retreats, seeking refuge from the immediate danger but committing to a long, exposed journey across the board. Challenging the knight's position, this maneuver immediately aims to dislodge the black knight from its aggressive forward post and potentially initiate pawn structure concessions in the black camp. Recognizing the king's exposed situation, black initiates a perilous retreat, seeking refuge from the looming knight's pressure and the open files. Preparing to consolidate the knight's position on c6, this prophylactic thrust aims to prevent any back-rank threats or surprising infiltrations by black's pieces, a wise precautionary measure given the current pawn structure and the looming endgame. The bishop finally finds an active diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's rook endgame advantage and potentially create counterplay by targeting the weakened pawns on white's kingside. This pawn push aims to seize crucial central space and prepare for further kingside expansion, potentially opening lines for the rook or even the king. Gaining a tempo by forcing the knight back to a less active square, this piece maneuver prepares for a positional squeeze, aiming to restrict white's king's scope and exploit the exposed pawn structure that has emerged. Unleashing the central pawn establishes a foothold for white's king and begins the battle for initiative in the core of the board, simultaneously preparing to advance the f-pawn further and gain space. Solidifying the pawn chain against white's knight and preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside offers some breathing room. The white monarch embarks on a bold journey, venturing out from its protective pawn shield towards the center, signaling an immediate intent to participate actively in the unfolding endgame. Unleashing a bold pawn push, black aims to disrupt white's spatial advantage and challenge the central control that has been established. This aggressive territorial claim creates immediate tactical complexities, forcing white to address the new pawn chain and potentially opening lines for black's pieces. The pawn advances, seeking to pry open the kingside and create weaknesses in white's defensive structure, a stark contrast to the quiet maneuvering that preceded it. Unlocking the bishop's potential, the king's side pawn structure now becomes a canvas for repositioning, aiming to either bolster defense or launch a counteroffensive. Solidifying the pawn structure is paramount as the game nears a king and pawn endgame, preventing any immediate breakthroughs by white's knight. Opening the kingside now initiates a race to exploit the now vulnerable black monarch. The pawn structure is irrevocably altered, creating an open file for the rook and a potential target on g5. However, it also liberates the black king from the shadow of its own doubled pawns. Opening the h-file now exposes your king to considerable danger as black's bishop and knight can converge on this vulnerable area with devastating effect, creating a tactical headache you'll need to resolve quickly. Relocating the knight to the edge of the board, the defender aims to neutralize the formidable knight outpost on c7 by potentially forcing an exchange or at least disrupting white's central control, though it concedes valuable space and potentially invites further pawn advances from the opponent. Activating the bishop to b5 creates an immediate pressure point on the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially isolate the knight that just landed on c7. White's intention is to exploit the compromised d5 pawn and force black into defensive concessions. Reorienting the knight to a better square offers a chance to improve piece activity and potentially contest the central pawns, though it does temporarily abandon defense of its immediate neighbor. Bishops often excel at controlling diagonals, and this capture opens up the g7 bishop to a much more active role, while simultaneously exposing the black king's remaining defenders. The black king, finally out of hiding, embraces its central role, seeking safety in the open. Introducing the knight to the kingside flank offers a new avenue for attack, eyeing potential squares like g7 and potentially creating a fork if the opponent isn't careful. The knight repositions to a more active square, eyeing the weak pawns on the kingside and potentially preparing to support a pawn push or infiltrate white's territory. Shifting the king's focus to the queenside, this repositioning aims to support potential pawn advances and offers an escape route should the center become too crowded. Creating a fortress around the weakened king, this pawn push solidifies black's defensive setup, preventing immediate pawn breakthroughs by white's knights and bishop. Shifting the knight to g3 aims to improve its defensive posture, freeing up the f5 square for a potential regrouping maneuver, and reinforcing the kingside against any sneaky infiltrations.